God has revealed himself to the fathers through the prophets. In the Old Testament, you have people like Abraham and Moses, and of course he revealed himself ultimately to a son. But then we have the apostles in the New Testament as well, and that's the process of revelation as God revealed himself. But then those prophets and apostles took that message and they wrote it into the scriptures. That's the process we look at now, and that's the process of inspiration. 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 16, we read that all Scripture is inspired by God. The Greek term there, my own opinion is that Paul's coining a word. He takes two common words, theos, the word for God, and pneustos, to breathe or to blow. God breathed, we could say. All Scripture is inspired or God-breathed by God, and profitable for teaching, for reproof, for correction, for training in righteousness, so that the man of God may be adequate, equipped for every good work. So the Scriptures, and notice that all Scriptures are God-breathed, not just a part of them. And it's not just the revelation, but it's specifically the things that were written down by those apostles and prophets. The Scriptures themselves, the writings, are that which were inspired by God. Verbal plenary view of inspiration. By verbal, we mean that the words themselves, as originally penned in the original documents, were inspired by God. And plenary, when you go to a seminar and they have the plenary session, that's when everybody is together. So it's all the words. Verbal is the words, and plenary is all of it. That is all the Scriptures. All the words of the Scriptures were inspired by God. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 18, Jesus really, I think, teaches this view of inspiration. For he says, "Truly I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke shall pass from the law, even until all is accomplished." We might say the dotting of the I or the crossing of the T, that all of it comes from God. Matthew chapter 4, verse 4, this is where Jesus he's out in the wilderness, he's being tempted by the devil, and he answers back to the devil as the devil tries to get him to do sort of a magic trick. And Jesus answered and said, "It is written, man shall not live on bread alone, but on every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God." And he's speaking of the Scriptures. The Scriptures are the very words of God. That the Scriptures are both infallible, that is, they are incapable of error, but that they are also inerrant, they do not contain error. And you ask me, well, which are the Scriptures? And I would say, well, it's both. It's I suppose, two sides of the same coin. Infallibility, however, and inerrancy do not demand a strict utilization of the rules of grammar. I pointed out earlier that there seems to be a place over in 2 Timothy where Paul sort of coins his own word. And rules of grammar, whenever, I started school in England when I was a very small boy, and then we moved to this other place, the United States, and they just speak differently. Well, it's not that they're speaking wrong, it's just different. And likewise, I have within the Scriptures the different writers who wrote. Some use a very, like Isaiah writes with a very high Hebrew. And then you get to Jeremiah, and he writes in sort of an everyday speech. And likewise, I get to the New Testament, and I read the very easy reading style of the Apostle John in the Gospel of John and the epistles, and yes, even in the book of Revelation. But then I go to the book of Luke or Acts or Hebrews, whoever writes that, and they write with a very high, sophisticated Hebrew. And yet they're all inspired, and that's not a reflection against inspiration. Also, infallibility and inerrancy do not demand a rigidly literalist interpretation. There are times when the writers use figures of speech just in the same way we do. I might say, well, the sun came up this morning. I'm not denying that the earth is rotating or saying that the sun is actually moving around the earth. No, but that's a figure of speech where I say it's raining cats and dogs. And I don't mean by that canines and felines are falling down from the sky. And no, we don't interpret the Scriptures that way. Also, infallibility and inerrancy do not demand a technical language of modern science. Same thing that I just described about the sunrise, the sunset. It speaks from a very earthy sort of, down-to-earth language. And the scriptures teach true truth, and yet they use regular, ordinary, everyday language. Infallibility and inerrancy do not demand a verbal preciseness in quotations. Oftentimes a story is told and then repeated, and you have the basic genre of what was said, the basic essence of what was said, without having to say necessarily word for word. And that's why I can read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and they'll be telling the same story, but the wording will slightly change. That's okay. That's allowed. That's not a reflection against infallibility or inerrancy. Finally, infallibility and inerrancy do not demand a comprehensive accounting of all truth. The scriptures, by their very nature, are partial in what they tell us. They don't tell us everything. Nobody ever tells everything that took place. There's just not enough hours in the day to do that. They tell us what we need to know. Infallibility and inerrancy do not demand the infallibility or inerrancy of non-inspired sources used by the biblical writers. That is to say, for example, there are places where the biblical writers might quote another source. Now, in Joshua chapter 10, there's a place where Joshua quotes the book of Jasher. We don't have the book of Jasher. And if we found the book of Jasher, I'm not guaranteeing that everything that would be in the book of Jasher would necessarily be true. But the part that was quoted was accurate. Or to use a New Testament example, there's a couple of two or three places where the Apostle Paul quotes, and he quotes a secular Greek philosopher. He's not saying that everything that secular Greek philosopher said was accurate, but just like a stop clock is right twice a day, a couple of two or three times, that pagan philosopher said some things that were true, and that's okay. Now, some people have wondered if the Bible itself is speaking of against inerrancy, and the example that is often brought up is 1 Corinthians chapter 7, where Paul, he's giving instructions, and he's giving instructions to the married. He says, "But to the married I give instructions, not I, but the Lord, that the wife should not leave her husband, but if she does leave, or she remain unmarried, or else be reconciled to her husband, and that the husband should not divorce his wife." But notice the part, he says, "I'm giving instructions, not the Lord." And then a few verses later he says, "But to the rest, I say, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who's an unbeliever, she consents to live with him, he must not divorce her." And the passage goes on from there. But notice, he makes a distinction between what God says, or what the Lord says, and what he's saying. And you say, well, is he giving his own opinion in part of it, and the other part is inspired? No, I don't think it's a reflection on inspiration. It's a reflection on the fact that he's quoting, at one point, he's quoting Jesus, because Jesus said, if you're married, don't leave your wife. But there were other things that Jesus didn't talk about and are not written in the Gospels. And so he says, well, the rest, I'm going to tell you something that Jesus did not talk about. And here it is. I think it's still inspired. It's still from God, but it had not been previously revealed. And so Paul is now giving us new revelation. And he's saying, I'm saying this, not the Lord, not Jesus. He didn't tell you about this, but I'm telling you about it now. And you can still trust in it, and you can still believe in it.